This week we're going to be looking at Chapter 7 and we'll focus on students with learning disabilities. The chapter itself begins with the description of definitions of learning disabilities, looking at both the views of specialists and the IDEA definition. We will look a little bit at the history of the field of learning disabilities as a whole, and we'll investigate the information about prevalence of learning disabilities, as well as the etiology of learning disabilities. We'll also focus on learning, social, and emotional characteristics of students who have learning disabilities. I want you to pay close attention to the information in the text about assessment of students with learning disabilities and response to intervention. You really want to have a good handle on how that works in terms of eligibility for services for special education. We'll also look at some classroom instructional strategies, 3 in particular, that you can use in your classrooms. It's important to think about perspective when it comes to these students and their families, so I want you to really pay attention to the needs of young children, adolescents, and adults with learning disabilities and their families as you go through this content. As you're reading, think about diversity and full inclusion and what issues can arise, and pay careful attention to the kinds of useful assistive technology devices that students with learning disabilities might be able to use in your classrooms. In terms of learning objectives, at the end of this week, you should be able to do these things. And if you can't, then you should go back and make sure. So this is the focus of the week. First, you should be able to summarize the key components of the IDEA definition of learning disabilities. This is important because if you are trying to make referrals at some point for students that are in your classroom, you need to understand what exactly the criteria are in terms of IDEA. You should be able to identify some possible causes of learning disabilities. I'd like you to be able to list representative learning and social emotional characteristics of those students who have learning disabilities. You should also be able to explain the concept of response to intervention, and bonus points if you can look at both the academic and the social behavioral components of RTI. I'd like you to be able to describe these instructional approaches: cognitive training, direct instruction, and learning strategies. Finally, I want you to be able to summarize the educational services for people with learning disabilities across their lifespans. We're going to start with defining learning disabilities. Now, the term learning disability represents a fairly new concept, a disability that's not physically apparent and can't be seen. In 1977, in order to comply with the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, a specific learning disability was determined to mean a disorder that can manifest itself in a child's inability to perform certain tasks in specified ways. The disability itself excludes children who have other disabilities that contribute to their learning delays. The definition has remained largely unchanged throughout later legislation, but the current federal criteria for diagnosing a learning disability includes the following. 1, the student does not achieve at the expected age and ability level when compared to age-level norms on a standardized assessment measure. Our current IDEA definition, we've got a team determines that a severe discrepancy is present between a child's actual levels of achievement and their potential for achievement in one or more of the following areas. Now, these are these 7 areas that they can be identified. Number 1, oral expression. 2, listening comprehension. 3, written expression. 4, basic reading skill. 5, reading comprehension. 6, mathematics calculation, and 7, mathematics reasoning. Or a student doesn't respond to response to intervention. So it's one of those 7 areas or this non-response. And then also, as with the definition currently, a student, the problems the student has are not a result of sensory impairments, intellectual disabilities, emotional problems, environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantages. This is called the exclusionary clause. So if a student is struggling to learn or is struggling to make progress, but it seems to be a direct result of economic disadvantage, we can't diagnose that student with a learning disability. Now, when we talk about prevalence of learning disabilities, the things that you as a classroom teacher need to know are, this is the largest category in special education. That's key. Second, gradual, steady decreases in numbers of identified students have happened in recent years, and learning disabilities as a diagnosis is more common in boys than in girls. Now, when it comes to the etiology of learning disabilities, one of the things that we know is that acquired trauma to the central nervous system, such as prenatal, perinatal, or postnatal injuries, can contribute to this. Some other areas would be genetic or hereditary influences. So family and twin studies actually indicate that learning disabilities can run in families. There has been research into biochemical abnormalities, but current research doesn't support allergies or vitamin deficiencies as the cause of learning disabilities. And then environmental possibilities. Factors such as poverty, malnutrition, lack of access to health care, and other factors may contribute to learning disabilities. When we look at the characteristics of students with learning disabilities, there are a variety of characteristics that can impact 3 areas for students. 1, language skills, and that includes reading, writing, and speaking. 2, mathematics skills, and 3, social and emotional factors. The characteristics, it's important to know that a learning disability is a lifelong disability, but it may present itself differently at different ages and developmental stages. When we talk about assessment of learning disabilities, IDEA requires that we have a multidisciplinary evaluation to determine whether a student meets the criteria for a learning disability, and IDEA specifically specifies that tests are administered by trained professionals, tests must be reliable and valid, the tests cannot be discriminatory, the tests have to be administered in the student's native language, and then finally, a single test cannot be used to determine eligibility. With this information from assessment, states may opt to use a discrepancy model or a response to intervention model for eligibility purposes. RTI, or response to intervention, is a fairly new concept that aims to keep students in the general education classroom and provides intensive assistance. RTI is generally a process that increases the levels of instructional intervention provided in the general education classroom. So if you have students who don't meet with success with these intensive interventions, then it's considered they may have a learning disability, and after these interventions don't work, then they're referred for a formal assessment. And what this does is it provides instructional support initially without having to wait for a special education label or for that process to engage. When we talk about the assessment methods, there's several different methods that we can use for really. First of all, norm-referenced assessment, and this is when we look at an individual's performance and then compare it to the performance of a normative group. We can look at criterion-referenced assessment, and this is when we measure a student's ability to meet or master a specific criteria. And then curriculum-based assessment, this is one of my favorites. This is where we do assessment of the curriculum that the child has already been taught. And then finally, we can also look at portfolio assessment. And the portfolio assessment allows us to consider the student's progress over a period of time. In terms of educational considerations, there's some controversy about what the least restrictive environment is for students with learning disabilities, even though most of them are placed in inclusive classrooms. Individualized instruction is the most effective, but 3 approaches are commonly used. Number 1, cognitive training. This helps students learn new ways to complete tasks and think about their learning. Number 2 is direct instruction. This is teacher-directed lessons that provide step-by-step explicit instruction. 3, mnemonic strategies. This helps students recall information by creating associations that are easily remembered. And then learning strategies. This is when we explicitly teach students how to find and learn new information. Thinking about students with learning disabilities across the lifespan, starting with young children, it's controversial or considered controversial to test for learning disabilities in young children due to variations in growth and development. Typically, the label developmental delay is used for young children instead of learning disability. And then there are different curriculum models. 1, we've got the developmental cognitive model. 2, the behavioral curriculum model, and 3, a functional curriculum. You'll want to go to your text to make notes about each of those 3 kinds. When we have our students who are transitioning into adulthood, transition planning has to occur through the IEP or the Individualized Education Program, and it must consider vocational training, preparation for post-secondary education, employment possibilities, independent living, social skills, as well as self-determination skills. And then when we're thinking about adults with learning disabilities, Adult learning disabilities impact our independent living, employment, social relationship, and satisfaction with life. So we do need to be aware of what supports and modifications are going to be needed as students transition from high school to college and then from college to adult success. Adults with learning disabilities often have time management issues. So as a teacher, if you can teach those things explicitly, that's helpful. They also often struggle with organizational skills and self-discipline and self-advocacy. So any opportunities that you have as a classroom teacher to teach those skills to all of your students, but especially those students with learning disabilities, is really is helpful. That's what we're talking about this week. If you have questions, please let me know, and have a good week.